Hello, Assalamu alaikum, adab, namaste to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Akeel Bilgrami sir, who knows, who needs no introduction, but nonetheless, I have requested Professor Nadeem Rizvi from Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University, to kindly introduce him to the audience. And I will only say this much, that it is really an honor to have you here. We have heard a lot about you. I read personally many articles written by you, and we'd like to see and get educated a lot today. Nadeem sir, Dr. Nadeem.
Okay. Thank you, Razi साहब, and all of you. सबको मेरा बहुत बहुत आदाब, salam, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to introduce Akeel Sahab to those very few who do not know him. I am quite sure that all of you are aware about who Akeel Bilgrami is. But for those who are not of the field, I would like to give a very short introduction to him. Akeel Bilgrami Sahab is a professor of philosophy at University of Columbia. Actually, he shifted to philosophy after having first been a student of English at Bombay. During his academic career, he has been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He did his PhD from and served at University of Michigan earlier. His field of interest include the philosophy of mind and language, and political philosophy and moral psychology, especially as they surface in politics, political economy, history, and culture. He has authored a number of books. He has also edited quite a few books, including a book in 1992, which is called Belief and Meaning, which was published by Blackwell. Another of his books is His Self-Knowledge and Resentment, which was published from Harvard University Press in 2006. A third of his book, which I would mention here, is Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, which was published by Harvard University Press. I hear that there are a number of other works which are in process and would be out soon. In fact, I have had the privilege of listening to Akeel Bilgrami Saab in person twice. Once in a gathering of historians in 2013 at Cuttack, and then at a seminar which was held in India International Center in New Delhi. At both the occasions, I was along with a team of scholars from AMU led by Professor Irfan Habib, whose student I am, to be counted amongst them. The first time which I heard Bilgrami Saab was during the Indian History Congress session, which was held at the Ravenshaw University of Cuttack in December 2013. At that Indian History Congress session, in spite of the fact that basically Akeel Saab is a professor of philosophy, he was made the sectional president of Contemporary History of India. And he gave a very brilliant presidential address, Capitalism, Liberalism, and Claims of Historical Necessity. Bilgrami Saab, till date, I remember that lecture of yours. As far as the topic of today is concerned, which is some reflections on secularism in India, It is something on which you have been talking since long. And you have also delivered a number of very interesting lectures before, some of which I would like to inform the persons who are connected here today that they are available on the net. It is a topic which is most relevant for us today. He has also written a number of papers on this very theme. I recently read one of his papers, which is present on the net, which is known as Secularism, its Content and Context. I urge all of you, it's a very short paper, not very long, and quite, I would request all of you to Google it and do read it. I hope that each of us would immensely benefit from the talk which Akeel Bilgrami Sahab would be delivering to us today. Over to Professor Akeel Bilgrami Sahab. Akeel Sahab.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to meet you all. And I'm going to begin by saying that really what prompted me to speak today on this subject is that there's a very widespread view in the last couple of decades in India that secularism in India is a very unique secularism, very different from secularism in Europe, where it started, and in the modern West. And I believe that that view is false. There's only one secularism. It's the secularism that had its origins in Europe. And Indian secularism, to the extent that it exists, and Indian secularism as it was adopted after independence, is exactly the same as European secularism. Whether or not it's been properly implemented is a question that one can raise, but basically there is no such thing as Indian secularism. Indian secularism is Western secularism. So that's what I'd like to argue. And this goes against a lot of thinking about secularism by Indian academics. This view that there is a peculiarly Indian secularism was first stated. I used to think it was first stated by Amartya Sen in an early paper of his, but Irfan Habib pointed out to me that President Radhakrishnan had said it much before Amartya Sen, and I didn't know about that. But of course now it's become, there's a whole infantry of academics who have been presenting this view, and that's what I want to say is wrong. So let me begin first of all, and this is something that is so elementary, but it isn't always kept in mind, and it's something that we should pay proper attention to, is I want to make a very rudimentary distinction between secularism and secularization. I don't think you can come to grips with the subject unless you keep this distinction firmly in mind at the very outset. Secularization, the term secularization, is a name for a process of transformation in society and in the minds of people. And it's a transformation by which there is an increasing loss of belief in God in the midst of creation, and an increase and a decrease in the practices of religion, whether it's church going or mosque going or temple going, whether it's a decrease in pious habits of dress, a decrease in pious habits of diet, a decrease in ritual. All of those constitute the process of secularization. At the doctrinal level, it's a loss of belief in God and in the propositions of various texts. And at the practical level, it's a loss it's a decrease in the exercise of rituals and habits of pious dress, diet, etc. So secularization began in Europe in early modernity, and its most powerful theorist was Max Weber, the German social thinker. And it should be understood as a name for a very general, slow, but increasing development of changes in the minds and practices of populations that were once religious, but are increasingly less so. Secularism, by contrast to secularization, is a completely different thing. It's a much more narrow idea. It's the idea of, it's a purely political doctrine. So it's a very much more specific idea. Secularism is the name for a conscious decision on the parts of centralized powers, called states, to steer their institutions and their laws away from the orbit and the influence of religion. So to steer the polity, which consists of laws and statist institutions, to steer it, protect it from a direct influence. Indirect influence, of course, is always there, but to protect it and steer it away from the direct influence of religion. So it's a very much more specific idea than secularization. Secularization is a name for general changes in society and mentality. Secularism is a doctrine about the polity's relative distance, relative protection from direct influence of religion. Now, I think this is an absolutely basic distinction, because for two reasons. The same person can be completely non-secularized, but completely secularist. So a person can be non-secularized in the sense that she or he is a believer and practices religion, believes in the doctrine, but is completely committed to secularism because she or he believes that the polity should be relatively free of the influence of religion. It's also a distinction that is well motivated by the simple fact that the same place can be highly non-secularized, but secularist. So the heartland of this country where I'm domiciled, America, is secularist, but it is not secularized at all. So this is a distinction which we must keep in mind. Now, sometimes the distinction can be muddied. So if you find, for instance, in Kemalist Turkey, that the state began to enforce secularization over and above being a secularist state it tried to enforce how people should dress, what they should eat, what script they should read, and so on. So sometimes you can find the distinction getting muddied when a state wants to enforce secularization over and above install a secularist polity. But that doesn't mean the distinction doesn't exist. It just means that, like all distinctions, there are some cases where it is not very clear how the distinction is being maintained and implemented. Okay, so that's one distinction that I think we must always keep in mind when we are talking about this subject. So why do I think that the situation in India has been one of having the same secularism as there was in Europe? Now, the reason why I think that is because I think we have to understand, and I want to talk, I mean, I realize that this audience is primarily interested in the situation of Muslims in India, and I want to speak to that, especially the current situation. But I think what we must get clear about is that all through the 20th century until independence, the first half of the 20th century, nobody talked very much about secularism. Nobody. In the decades-long freedom movement, secularism was not a term or an idea or ideal that was much spoken of. Now that's something that we need to diagnose. Why was that? And I think one of the things that we ought to record is that the leaders of the national movement in India were very clear that there was a real sense in which if you understand how secularism arose in Europe, there is no reason to think that it should exist in India. But for that, you have to understand why secularism emerged in Europe. So here's a very crude and simple story of why it emerged in Europe. In Europe, after the Westphalian Peace, which was in the middle of the 17th century, a new kind of entity had emerged, which later came to be called the nation. As a social scientific category, the term nation became a standard description of this new kind of entity that had emerged in the middle of the 17th century, as in the aftermath of the Westphalian Peace. And what is very interesting is that at the same time as it emerged, scattered locations of power all over Europe became more and more centralized. In fact, for instance, the first nationwide tax that was ever imposed in the history of the world was by Oliver Cromwell in the interregnum of the 17th century. And that's the first initial symptoms of a highly centralized location of power, what they call nation state. So a new kind of entity, the nation, emerged, an increasingly centralized source and location of power had emerged, and these two things became completely fused in the history of Europe after the 17th century, increasingly more and more fused all the way down to the 19th century. So the nation-state, a hyphen was used to bring out the fact that you couldn't separate the idea of a nation from the idea of a state. That the nation and the state were simply an integrated entity. There was no separating them. And what's interesting is that this time, because of the rise of modern science, people began to say that old forms of justifying the state were just not convincing to people anymore. The old forms of justification of the state were that the monarch who personified the state had a divine right to exist and exercise power. And with the rise of new ideas in the mid-17th century onwards, this justification and legitimation of state power began to lose its hold on the minds of people, and a new kind of justification was needed. And that justification, the new justification, was no longer theological, divine rights, but it was really a justification that I would say owed to political psychology, not to theology, but to political psychology. So what was the psychology by which state power was legitimated in this new era? Well, everywhere it was legitimated by the fact that now that you had this integrated entity, the nation-state, you legitimized the power of the right-hand side of this hyphenated conjunction, nation-state. You legitimized state power by creating a feeling, a psychology, a feeling for the left-hand side of the hyphenated conjunction, the nation. So people were encouraged to develop and cultivate a feeling for the nation, and that legitimized the exercise of state power, because the nation and the state were, as I said, a totally integrated idea. So state power was legitimated by what later came to be called nationalism, a feeling for the nation. And nationalism became the source of justifying the exercise of state power. This is everywhere in Europe. Now, how did European nation states generate this feeling in the populace for the nation? Everywhere this was done by finding an external enemy within the territory of the nation, saying that it is to be despised, it is to be suppressed and subjugated. The external enemy inside the territory is to be despised and subjugated, because the nation is ours, not theirs. That's how the feeling was created for the nation. The feeling is the nation is ours, not theirs. So there always has to be an external enemy within who must be despised and subjugated. That's how the feeling for the nation, thereby the justification of the state, was generated everywhere in Europe. Later, when numerical forms of study and statistical forms of study were introduced into the study of politics, this began, you got notions of majority and minority, and this began to be called religious majoritarianist sources for nationalism. And that's the history of Europe. The history of Europe is the history of legitimizing state power through nation-building exercises of this kind, in which minorities, very often religious minorities, the Jews, the Irish Catholics, the Protestants in Catholic countries, the Catholics in Protestant countries, and nationalism was a term that was coined later for this method by which state power was justified. And when this happened, there was quite serious fighting back. I've lost my, sorry. There was quite serious backlashes from the minority religions. The Protestants fought back in Catholic countries. The Catholics fought back in Protestant countries. And this generated a kind of civil strife. This generated a kind of civil strife. And as a result, it began to be felt that the real problem, though it arose out of religious majoritarianism to justify state power in the new entity called a nation, though it emerged with religious majoritarianism, because there was religious minoritarian backlashes to this, that religion itself is a problem. And so religion must be steered away from the orbit of the polity. That's the idea of secularism. Secularism emerged in that history of European exercises of nation building to legitimize a new kind of state. That's this is the genealogy of secularism. It started that way, and because of the civil strife, it began to be felt religion itself is the problem, and so we need a new doctrinal configuration to combat this civil strife. That's the origins of secularism. It happened in Europe. Now, what is interesting is when I said earlier that nobody talked about this secularism in India, basically till just around the period in the 40s, because of the acrimonies around partition. Gandhi and Nehru began to talk about secularism explicitly only in the 40s. They didn't do it basically the first 3.5 decades, or almost 3.5 decades of the freedom movement. It was just not part of the vocabulary of the Indian national movement. Now, why is this? Because, and Gandhi was very explicit about this, but Nehru is also explicit about it. Nehru is considered to be the great secularist, the builder of modern India and all that. Nehru was just as clear, especially in his book Discovery of India, which people don't like very much because it's not secularist enough for them. But I think it's Nehru's best book. Nehru himself, and Gandhi more explicitly, basically argued that if secularism emerged in this narrative that I've just told you in Europe, for the reasons that it emerged in Europe, they said none of this has happened in India. So secularism is irrelevant to India. So Discovery of India uses the term unself-conscious pluralism. I think that's the term that Nehru uses. He says, India has always been, throughout history, an unself-consciously pluralist society. And it's precisely pluralism that was destroyed in Europe by these changes that I was mentioning to you, by this process, this genealogy that I was mentioning to you. And Gandhi and Nehru argued that nothing of this kind has happened in India, in Indian history. So secularism was never relevant for them. So the reason why I say this is that it explains not just why secularism was not very prominent in this whole period prior to independence, but also it explains why we are so rightly obsessed with secularism ever since the 1980s in India. You see, the reason to genealogically study something, to study why its origins are, what its origins are, what its conceptual, historical origins are. The reason to do that is that if a term has this philological or genealogical story behind it, then it's relevantly applied at other times when the conditions under which the term arose and coined is replicated, or if not replicated, at least approximated. Right? So the point is that in the 80s onwards, from the 80s onwards, India was completely on the path that Europe was on from this period of early modernity to late modernity that I was describing a little while ago. So the conditions in Europe which gave rise to secularism genealogically were really only replicated from the 1980s on in India. The Muslims became the external enemy within in a very explicit way from the 1980s on, and the relevance of secularism became obsessive, quite rightly, from that period. So genealogy is important for that reason. You look for conditions that are replicated or approximate the genealogical conditions for something, and that's when you apply the term again with the same force, the same urgency, and the same anxiety. Okay, so that's the reason for saying that secularism is a European doctrine, and it has the same idea in India, and its relevance becomes urgent in the 1980s. Okay, having said this, I need to say a lot of things that must qualify what I'm saying or complicate what I'm saying. You see, there's a great tendency amongst historians, social scientists, and so on, to think that what happened in Europe that I described, and what I'm saying happened from the 1980s on, actually began to happen much earlier in India from the 1920s on. So I have to address that problem, because there is no doubt of the fact that there was a kind of majoritarian element even in the Congress party from the 1920s on. There was the Mahasabhite element within the Congress, which was noticeable from the 1920s and, existed all the way decades even after independence. So you have to acknowledge that. And you have to acknowledge that there were certainly some Muslim backlashes to the Mahasabhite element, to say Savarkar's idea of Hindutva, all through this decades-long period that I've been describing. But what is certainly also clear is, I think we need to make a distinction which historians don't explicitly make but should make, and that's a distinction which, as a philosopher, I think is really very important that we must make, is a distinction between antecedents and roots. It's very important to make that distinction. what do I mean by the distinction between antecedents and roots? Well, a lot of people think that the roots of what we are witnessing today, or from the 1980s on, the roots of it began in the 1920s at least, if not earlier. So it is often said, the roots of Narendra Modi and Hindutva today goes back to the Mahasabhites in the Congress Party itself, or to Savarkar, and so on. The roots of Muslim communalism began with the Khilafat movement, which was a movement which mobilized Muslims as Muslims. I think this is wrong. I think we need a distinction between antecedents and roots. You can say that the Mahasabhite element was an antecedent to Hindu majoritarianism today, but it's not the roots. See, for something to be a root, to be established as a root, you have to actually show that there's an organic causal path from the root to the flowering. Nobody has shown that. I mean, I've read extensively on the history of the 20th century, and nobody has shown anything like that. So at best you can say that there were antecedents, maybe there were some undecided questions, unresolved questions, and so on. But to show that they're roots, you have to show a far more detailed causal path that nobody has shown. However, I do think that in the 1980s, something like the roots for Hindutva were laid down, or just before the 1980s, for all sorts of reasons. In that period, 70s, 80s, the idea that there's an external enemy within which must be subjugated and repressed and so on, is something which really had its roots laid in the period soon after the emergency and mushroomed in the 80s. For reasons and conditions that are peculiar to that period. What are those conditions? Well, one of the conditions which we don't often like to mention, but we ought to be honest about it, is that in the emergency, the Hindu right showed a lot of courage, showed some courage in opposing the emergency. The center left, I mean the Marxist left, the CPM and all, were opposed to the emergency, but the center left just lay down like doormats for Indira Gandhi and her son to stamp on them and destroy the liberties of the country. And the Hindu right showed some courage. And that gave them a moral high ground, a kind of respectability in the mainstream of politics, which not only brought the BJP into the mainstream of parliamentary politics, but it also gave rise to respectability to the cultural Hindu right in the other surround of the Sangh Parivar. So there's no denying that this emerged in the emergency, a kind of ethos where a certain respectability was gained. The BJP had, the Jan Sangh had hardly any seats. It was not a force to reckon with in parliamentary politics. It's only later, and I'm saying the roots began to be laid with a kind of respectability that these ideas, this way of thinking, these policies, in the emergency and its immediate aftermath. There was other things that people have written quite extensively about how the Congress Party, starting with the Punjab, in order to fight the Akali Dal, encouraged a kind of Hindu majoritarianism. And of course, we know from all the episodes, with the Shah Banu case and the Ayodhya opening of the locks and so on, that the Congress Party was very complicit in a great deal of this, because they were seeking majoritarian electoral support, because the Garibi Hatao program was a total flop, and they were looking for a populist base, and slowly began to adopt, the Congress Party began to adopt, under Rajiv Gandhi, even the right-wing Hindu majoritarian, the Hindu majoritarian support base, electoral support base. Okay, all this has been written about, especially this has been widely studied. And then later, somewhat later, with the Mandal Commission, a very deep form of roots began to be laid for anti-Muslim ethos and sentiment, because what the Mandal Commission did to Indian politics was show how deeply Hinduism was divided by caste. It brought out caste divisions, it brought out caste hostilities out into the open by creating a whole culture, political culture of benefits for backward castes. And it created a kind of demandingness, a democratic demandingness in the Indian polity that never existed before. And the upper caste Hindu establishment really began to get anxious that Hinduism's caste divisions were being exposed. So a very, very concerted effort began to generate a feeling that Hinduism was in fact completely united, and it should be united because there's an external enemy against which it should be united, which is the Mussalman, the Indian Mussalman, and that consolidated very deeply the ethos which we now call Hindutva. It was a concerted, systematic appeal by RSS and its offshoots in the parliamentary field and in the cultural field to combat the political democratic forces that had emerged with the Mandalization of politics. And that should not be underplayed. It's a very, very important ground for finding the external enemy, the Mussalman, so that we can be united, Hindus can be united against it. It was a way of combating a force in politics which showed Hinduism to be divided. All right, so these are the conditions which really laid the roots for what we see now. And I think the earlier things that people tend to trace as roots were merely antecedents. Now, there's an enormous amount of I realize that a lot of historians and a lot of social scientists and political analysts will disagree with this, and there's a great tendency to say, no, the roots were laid much earlier. I spent quite an acrimonious evening. Javed Akhtar began to tell me once that the Khilafat movement was the source of Muslim communalism in India, which I thought was historically so completely wrong-headed. But that's a fairly common view, and I think I would need to say a lot more maybe in the discussion. Some of you will want to raise questions about it, but anyway, that's a general line of thought that I wanted to present, to say that secularism is European secularism, India is European secularism, that it began to have the urgency it did in when European conditions were replicated in India. And that is, in general, how one should think about the nature of concepts, that they have relevance when the genealogical conditions are replicated or approximated. Now, of course, there are other things to say about secularism, which is that quite apart from its genealogical side, there's its analytical side. How do you define secularism? And there, I think, again, it is completely European in the Indian Constitution. I would define secularism as very differently from the way Amartya and Radhakrishnan and a number of academics define it now. Here's how they define it. They all claim that secularism in India is different because it's just neutral equidistance from all religions. The state is neutral between all religions. That's Amartya Sen's term. It's, by the way, also Charles Taylor's term for it. It's a Western philosopher who's written on secularism. And I don't think secularism is a neutral equidistance from between all religions on the part of the state. I think secularism is a different doctrine. It's a doctrine that emerged in Europe. And if you ask me how to define it, I would say that the reason why people haven't come to the right definition of it is because the right analytical definition. Now, I'm no longer talking about genealogy. I'm talking now how to define, analyze secularism. I would say people have not come up with the right definition of secularism because in the West, secularism was very confusedly defined. And Indian theorists rightly saw the confusion and said, we can't possibly accept that as secularism. But then rather than give a less confused definition than European theory did for European secularism, they then turned to this idea of neutrality between religions, which I think is completely wrong. So what I think the idea of separation, the wall of separation between religion and the state, is a very confused way of describing European secularism or Western secularism, United States secularism. It's a very confused way of doing it. Why? Well, people have pointed out that if there's a wall of separation which you're not supposed to breach, and that's what secularism is, a wall of separation between church and state, that wall was constantly perforated, breached, whenever secularist laws and policies were implemented. So if there was the reform of Hindu law in the Hindu Code Bill, for instance, in the 50s, breached the wall that's supposed to separate secular separation of church and state by the state interfering, reforming, reinterpreting religious laws and principles. That's violating the separation. So it's a terrible definition of secularism. But that doesn't mean one should give up the right way to define European secularism. The right way to define it, I feel, is as follows, and I'll say it quickly. And this is explicit in the Indian Constitution. The right way to define it is has 3 clauses. The first clause is the Constitution allows freedom of religious belief and practice. That's clause 1. There's a constitutional provision of the freedom of religion in its practice and belief. Clause 2, this is the definition of secularism. Clause 2 is the Constitution has principles that it's committed to, which are fundamental, and these principles don't mention religion or opposition to religion. They're innocuously described as far as religion is concerned. There's no mention of religion or opposition to religion at all. So what are such principles? Principles such as free speech. Principles such as gender equality, gender justice. There's no mention of religion, there's no mention of opposition to religion. That kind of disputation is not part of the content of these principles. They're neutrally, they're innocuously descriptive principles, free speech, gender justice, etc. Basic commitments of Okay, so 2 clauses. The first clause is freedom of religion and religious belief and practice. 2, principles which don't mention religion or opposition to religion. Okay. These are 2 planks. And then there's a third plank, which I would say is a plank, is a clause that is about these first 2 clauses. So if you fancy social scientist vocabulary, you want to call it, it's a meta principle. Right? It's a principle about these first 2 principles. Right? And this third principle says, if there is a clash between the first, the allowance of free allowance of religious practice and belief, if there's a clash between what is allowed by the first principle and the principles articulated in the second clause, things like free speech, gender justice, if there's a clash between the 2, always give priority to the second clause. So in my work, I've called it a lexicographical ordering. It doesn't matter, that's a term in mathematics and economics now, but it doesn't matter what you call it. The idea is perfectly simple. Clause 1 says freedom of religious practice and belief. Clause 2 mentions certain general principles. These are both in the Constitution. And secularism, as committed to in the Constitution, is the idea that if there's a clash between 1 and 2, 2 gets priority. That's it. That's secularism. I've not mentioned separation of church and state or anything like that. This was always what Europe understood by secularism. It's what the Indian Constitution understood by secularism. It's absolutely explicit. Anybody who reads the Indian Constitution will see that these are what the Constitution is committed to. This threefold set of clauses. Now, what is absolutely correct is that many people including Nehru and others. You find it in the Karachi Resolution, for instance, of in the early 30s. Many people talked of neutrality between religions, but they never called that secularism. That's something only Sen and Radhakrishnan and all these Indian professors have called it. But nobody called that secularism. So one of the questions we should ask is, what is the relationship between the commitment to being neutral between religions and what I'm calling secularism, this priority of the second clause over the first in the Constitution? What is the relationship between the two? Well, that's also perfectly clear. The idea is not that neutrality between religions is an alternative idea of secularism. Rather, neutrality between religions is something that you make sure happens when you prioritize the third clause over the second. You don't favor some religions and not others when you do that. So let's take an example. Let's take the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom favors free speech. It's a fundamental principle of its constitution. The United Kingdom, just as I said about secularism all over Europe, it favors also freedom of religion and practice. Now, in the United Kingdom, two things happened over a period of a few decades. The first was, there was a novel called The Last Temptation of Christ, which was banned because Mary Whitehouse said it's blasphemous. It's blasphemous because it describes how Christ has homosexual fantasies while he's on the cross and so on. Mary Whitehouse says this is blasphemous, so the book was banned. It was blasphemous against Christianity. Some decades later, Salman Rushdie writes satanic verses. There was a hue and cry about it. Many Muslims in all over Britain demanded that the book be banned. The British state said, no, we prioritize free speech over religion. We prioritize the second clause over the first. That is a non-symmetrical, non-neutral, non-equidistant implementation of the only definition of secularism there is. So what I'm saying is this idea of neutrality between religions is a constraint on how you should implement secularism. It's not an alternative notion of secularism. In Britain, it was non-neutrally implemented. Salman Rushdie's book was not banned. Kazan Saki's book was banned. It favored Christianity over Islam's protests against blasphemy. That is non-neutrality between religions. But it's just a failure to implement secularism properly. It's not an alternative to secularism. And now you can raise the question, when we made exceptions to Muslim personal laws, did we do exactly what Britain did? We reformed Hindu laws, but we did not reform personal laws. And so you can ask the question, is exactly the same thing that happened in Britain? And I would say, yes, you could say that. There were reasons given for it, and we can talk, those are controversial things. A lot has been written about it. Lots of excellent stuff has been written on that subject. But in the large picture, I would say it's got nothing to do with secularism, non-neutrality, etc. It's the idea is that secularism was put in abeyance in the Muslim personal law case. And that, of course, is a controversial issue. We can talk about that. I'm sure many of you have opinions on it, and there's a lot of excellent literature on it. But anyway, so I've given you a definition of secularism, which is just what the secularism definition in Europe is, and it's what India adopted, and India adopted it. It's part of the analytical part of the constitution, which underlies the reforms that were made of the Hindu Code Bill and so on. But the urgency of secularism emerges in the 80s, not just the technical side, which emerges in the reform of laws, personal laws and so on, but other laws too, you know, laws about temple entry and other things. But the genealogical side and the urgency and so on of these implementations is really something that started in the 80s. Okay, I'll stop now and take questions. I think I've talked quite a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bilgrami. Rafat, can you take over about for the questions?
Yes, I will.
And please tell others that they should just ask questions, no commentaries, because there is a shortage of time. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Bilgrami. This is wonderful to hear you and very well defined this secularism versus secularization. So my name is Rafat Hussain, and there are two options to ask a question. One, you can raise the hand, digital hand you see in your chat box, or you send me a comment. And if you are interested to ask a question. So, and please identify yourself, because some names are not really the real names in the Zoom pictures. And please be brief, as Razi Bhai said, and I request this same for Dr. Bilgrami to be brief in your comments. Okay, so the first question is from Peace Vigil. Yes, I know it's not a real name, so he will ask the question. Please go ahead.
Sure. Hello, my name is Shireen. I'm speaking from South Africa. Thank you for taking my question. Sir, I would like to know that when you said that the right wing, the Hindu right wing, stood up against the emergency, I would very much appreciate if you could give some specific examples. Thank you.
Well, a whole, you know, even the people who joined Jayaprakash and so on, many of them, many Jansangh people who became later members of parliament of Jansangh and so on, very much behind the Jayaprakash movement. And I think that this was an essential part of the protests against the emergency. You know, the young Vajpayee, all of these people were very much behind the protests against the emergency, in a way that the Congress left and the center left, the CPI and so on, were not. And for the first time, as a result of that, the right-wing Hindu view began to have some respectability. All the people who were...
Thank you, sir.
Okay, the next is Tariq Farooqi, please.
Thank you very much for your commentary. The question is, you know, which way are we headed in India? Do you see anything changing? Do you see that if we can salvage secularism in the future for India?
Well, you know, in India, things have changed a lot in the last, especially since 2000. In the 21st century, things have changed enormously, I think. You see, one of the interesting things to me is, and lots of people have no doubt noticed this, is that after the destruction of the Babri Mosque, Muslims fought back. They showed some real agency. Some of it was actually bad, some of it was violent. You may disapprove of the violence and so on, but nevertheless, Muslims showed agency then. But in the last decade or more, Muslims have gone into their shells until last winter. Last winter was an astonishing series of events, which it's one of the great tragedies of our time that the pandemic has put a halt to them. But I hope it's just an interruption. But if you put aside last winter, which was a remarkable morale-boosting involvement of Muslims in Indian popular politics, in the decade or more, just before last winter, Muslims were completely inside their shells for obvious reasons. Anybody who was who notices how more powerful and successful and effective Hindutva has become in the last decade and a half than it was in the early 90s after the Babri destruction. The menace for Muslims is far, far greater now. And so they did withdraw into their shells for a long time. In a way, I mean, it's very fascinating. There's a real differential here. Dalits did not. Dalits, in fact, emerged with real agency in the very period that the Muslims withdrew into their shells. The Dalits were really fighting back, and sometimes even violently, against the violence that was constantly perpetrated on them. But the Muslims did not. So that has been a real change. And now, since the last winter, there's this remarkable flowering of protest on the streets and in the Maidans of India, and the squares, and the Muslims were in the forefront. In fact, they started it, and the students and other activists got on. And that was a very, very hopeful sign. And it's really interesting to analyze what prompted it, what its nature was. My own feeling is that what happened last winter was something that's, in a way, really is so creative and novel. It goes beyond what Gandhi and Nehru achieved in mobilization and others. It's beyond, in fact, the theoretical and legislative achievements of Ambedkar. It's a remarkable thing. We can talk about it if you like, but it's very interesting to notice that for a decade and a half before that, the Muslims were really very withdrawn, and the Dalits were, by contrast, very active and highly mobilized.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. The next one is Aftab Ansari Saab. He has the similar question. Aftab bhai, do you still want to ask, or you are satisfied?
Yes, my question was similar, so I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Aftab bhai. Next one is Munsed Alam. Please, if my apology if I did not pronounce your name right. Munsed Alam.
It's Murshid Alam.
Okay.
Professor Bilgrami, recently there were two pieces in the Indian Express, one by Professor Ibn Yadav and the others by Pratap Bhanu. Yadav argued that the Hindu right gained momentum because we did not take religion seriously. So I would like to know your view on this. What is the role of religion in politics, or should we take religion more seriously to fight back against the Hindutva forces in India? Thank you.
Right. So I did read that exchange, and it was an interesting exchange. There's serious issues there, and I think my own sense is that there are two things going on. Let me step back a bit, and because though the exchange between them I feel is relatively on the surface, there are deeper things underlying it, which don't surface in there in Mehta's written piece as a response to Yogendra's piece. You see, let's step back. We've talked about secularism, but there's another doctrine which is distinct from secularism, and it's something that emerged first in post-Second World War Europe. This is the doctrine of multiculturalism, which is not the same as secularism. It's a doctrine that emerged as a result of issues that emerged in Second World War Europe. What happened after the Second World War in Europe? Well, the war was devastating to a lot of European countries, and there was a lot of loss of labor power, manpower. Many in the population were killed in the war, and there was a lot of destruction. European nations were reconstructing war-torn economies. And because of the loss of manpower in the wars, basically over 2 wars, they really needed a labor force, especially a labor force to do its most menial labor, which others in the native populations of Europe didn't want to do. So, in post-Second World War Europe, migration was invited from the erstwhile colonies of European nations. And much of this migration was, people in relatively non-secularized traditional societies, and they were religious people. And when they came, they found themselves facing a great deal of racial hostility. And they felt that secularism was not speaking to the particular problems they faced as minorities, religious minorities in these countries. Because secularism was against all religion entering the polity in any direct way. Right? But the religious minorities of Europe, suffering from racial hostility, felt, but this is too blunt an instrument. It's not speaking to the fact that our religion gives us a source of dignity and autonomy in the face of real racial hostilities everywhere. In the banlieue of Paris, in Bristol, and in Kreuzberg, and so on. All these places were felt that we need a new doctrine. Secularism is too blunt, which speaks to religious minorities and the particular problems they face. Just ushering religion out doesn't speak sufficiently directly to the minoritarian racial sufferings and sufferings of religious communities there. So a new doctrine was articulated, basically multiculturalism. I mean, look, I'm putting it crudely, but still, I don't think it's... Multiculturalism is the idea that there are no... it's different from secularism, and it's basically the idea that there are no majorities in a society. Everything should be as if this is just a series of minority religious cultures or cultural groups. And that's true, but it's distinguishable from secularism for that reason. And one of the things is that I think what happens is that when multiculturalism emerges, and there's the strong feeling that in the part of, say, Maghrebi Muslims in Paris and Muslims, Pakistani Muslims in London and Bristol and so on, the feeling is that not only are the right-wing nationalists attacking these minority groups, but even the secularists are using secularism as a tribal weapon to say that this multiculturalism that these demands of minorities is not modern. It's not part of European history and so on. So secularism can become a tribal weapon to beat minority demands of migrant communities. So there becomes a clash between secularism and multiculturalism. Now, what Yogendra and Pratap are arguing echoes some of this. What Yogendra is saying is, look, you can't leave out the religious ethos of this country, that people are yearning for some people to speak to them in the religious discourse and vocabulary of their homes, of their traditions, of their cultures, and so on. And what the post-Nehruvian state has done is ushered that out too much from our discourse and our public address. And I have to say that what I think that was achieved in the protest movements is remarkable, because it shows the debate between Yogendra and Pratap to be irrelevant. Because what the young people and the women and the Muslims and so on were doing in the streets and so on was combining the poetry and the art and the Kabir chants and slogans and so on of popular religion, Sufi, Bhakti, they were channeling all that in order to speak for the constitution, completely abstract, propositional, modern Western ideas. And that is a tremendous achievement, I think, of what of the mobilizations of last winter, is that this debate was completely made irrelevant because it was integrated. The two things that are part of this debate were integrated by these mobilizations. That's a very interesting creative development. I really want to stress how creative it is. You see, if you take the three great figures who everybody reads and thinks of as exemplary, Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar, rightly admired, all three of them. But look at what they achieved and see how the young activists and women and students and so on surpassed them, went beyond them last winter. Gandhi was always against the codes and constitutions of modernity. He basically did not think that politics, I shouldn't exaggerate, he wasn't against those things. His overall political philosophy was indifferent to codes and constitutions. For him, politics was mobilization. For him, politics was anti-imperialist mobilization, and politics was the learning to live together.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. There are 7 more people lined up, and I am noting them in the sequence I received them. Next is Fazal Khan Saab. Fazal bhai, unmute yourself and then.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
So actually, first, thank you for very fascinating talks. I'm a scientist, so philosophy sounds better because whole life did the science. But my question is that, is it really, isn't the secularism has its own limitations? Because of the democracy, you have elections. So politicians have to listen to the majority. So can you really have the secular state in parliamentary system where there is the election, or even presidential system where there is the election? Politicians have to tailor their view according to majority. And in fact, that's what's happening in India. And in fact, it happened in US also. If you see the Trump, so is it possible to have a real secularism or secularist in India against majority?
Well, it's becoming harder and harder, and I mean, I don't. What I will not deny is that a very large section of the population, which hitherto was not committed to Hindutva, seems to be talking quite openly about a Hindu nation. And that is, especially in the middle classes, for various reasons that should be diagnosed. And I think it's there's no denying what you say, that it becomes harder when there's so much commitment to the idea of a Hindu nation in the minds of ordinary people. But that is why I feel that to now, at this juncture, to talk about multiculturalism and about how Hindus are just one more minority, everybody should be treated as one, is hopeless. I mean, it goes against it's the fight against an ethos which is so strong that it's not going to get anywhere. I think the young people and activists last winter were right, because they were basically saying, we've got a constitution. We've got certain constitutional commitments that are secularist, and that's what we are fighting for. They weren't taking this completely unrealistic view that we can achieve this multicultural ideal where even the Hindus are just another community. There was no such thing. They were just saying, we've got a secularist constitution, let's just fight for that, for old, standard modern ideas of citizenship that were the commitments of country. And so I think that right now, you're certainly right that it's very hard. But if you answer your question, you really have to answer a more specific question, which is, can the BJP be really successfully and effectively opposed? Okay. And that's what your question amounts to, right? Rather than put it in abstract terms, whether secularism can be achieved in a nation with a changing mentality of this kind, the real question is, can this regime and this government, this party and Hindutva ideology that it represents, can it be defeated electorally and I think can its policies be stayed, overturned, and so on? And I think on that issue, on that question, there's a total schizophrenia in the country. I think on the large issues, on the national country, the BJP has on the parliamentary field has a lot of control and dominates. But in the states, in different states, the BJP has been defeated, in the parliamentary field, and of course that's a very, very brittle field, because, as you know, people can be bought and there are defections, and it happens repeatedly. But nevertheless, there is in the parliamentary field opposition in the regions, in the states. And to some extent, you have to hope for the best there. And, it's a sort of shocking, depressing situation when third-rate politicians like Mamata Banerjee and Thackeray and all are going to be our saviors. But, you know, that is one line of opposition. The other line of opposition on the national level, right, that's, I think, only happening on the streets in the Madam, not in the parliamentary field. That's what I mean by schizophrenia. In the national level, on the big issues, the opposition is really in the protest movements.
Thank you, Bilgrami Saab. Let's move on. Another is Shinod NK, and Vishal Saab, you are next after Shinod. So have patience, please. Shinod NK, please.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for an exciting conversation. So I'm a faculty in the philosophy department in University of Hyderabad. So you have been employing this distinction between antecedent and root or cause. So I've been listening to many of your talks where you made this distinction, and it really made sense to me. But what I am looking for is, can you elaborate it a little bit? Because I find these making causal connections in social sciences, especially history, extremely difficult, demarcating antecedent from causes.
All right, all right.
Well, look, take, for example, the phenomenon, take the Khilafat movement. The idea that the Khilafat movement is the root of somebody like the Delhi Imam, Bukhari, or Shahabuddin or something. Who's shown that? I mean, you know, you have to have some tracing. Now, look at the conditions I mentioned by contrast, right? That the Hindu right politicians in the parliamentary field that move from the peripheral success of the Jan Sangh to the enormous success of the BJP in 20 years, in a 20-year period at most, less. It owes to things like the upper caste response to Hindutva, the respectability that was gained in the late 70s by the Hindu right. See, those speak to the immediate causes that you can establish as, you know, emerging and building on each other. The rest, I think, going back to the Khilafat, I mean, I think all you can show is that there were some unresolved questions there, but there is no causal path that you can, nobody can trace it, nobody has traced it. It's just loose talk. So that's what I mean. I think you really have to make this methodological distinction in historiography, and it's bizarre to me that it's not explicitly been made. I mean, people may agree with what I'm saying, or, you know, take the same view, but what underlies it is this distinction, I feel.
Thank you. Next is Vishal Lavania Saab, please.
Greetings, Professor. Thank you for your talk. The first clause of the definition of your secularism is about the freedom of religion. Does the definition say something about freedom from religion, or is it silent on that matter?
I can't understand the question. I couldn't hear it. Can somebody
Can you find just now?
Please read again.
Razi, can you repeat it?
Please, Vishal, please go ahead.
Professor, do you hear me fine just now?
Yeah, go ahead. Say it again, please.
So the first clause in the definition of secularism is about freedom of religion. Does the definition say something about freedom from religion? For example, I'm an atheist or a humanist myself. Does it address that, or is it silent on the matter? What is your view about it, and does it encompass that in your view?
All right.
Thank you, Vishal.
So let us say, I don't particularly approve of the expression, but let us say that, to put it very, very more simply than it should be, but let's just say that secularism, if you broadly say secularism is the freeing from religion of state laws and institutions, to free them from the direct influence of religion. So that's freedom from that. That's the very broad idea of secularism. And now what I said was, that is what emerged in Europe in order to deal with the strife that I was describing. And that strife, I said, was replicated or approximated from the 80s on in India. And I was saying that the way it is done is not by this loose and confused talk of separation of religion from state, but this freedom of state institutions and laws from the influence of religion is captured by this threefold constitutional set of ideas that I mentioned, principles that I mentioned. The first being freedom of religion, freedom people have to practice their religion and believe in it. The second is the constitutional commitment to certain principles such as free speech, gender equality, etc., that don't mention religion, don't mention opposition to religion. They are completely free of talk of religion. And the third clause, which says if there's a clash between the free exercise of religion, and the principles of, say, free speech, etc., then the principles come first. They must be
Thank you, Bilgrami sir.
That's the relationship between freedom of, that's one of the three clauses, and this general idea of liberating the state and its institutions and laws from religion.
All right.
Okay, the next one is Akeel Zahir Saab, and after that is Mayank. Please go ahead, Akeel Saab. Akeel Zahir Saab.
Thank you very much, Akut. Good seeing you and listening to you. It was a wonderful talk. Maybe it's not a question, and you might want to pass over it. But I was very concerned about the fact that the emergency was kind of a watershed transformation of Indian political alignment. And I wonder if you've considered the influence of the Cold War and the Western influence, specifically the CIA, in uniting the Socialist Party, which Jayaprakash Narayan and George Fernandez were part of, with the BJP, and really was kind of an attack on Indian secularism, because secularism was also viewed by the West as some way aligned to the to USSR and to the left.
Well, I'm not sure how much. I think there's a very general influence of sort of new kinds of economic arrangements that make a difference, a great deal of difference to Indian politics. Involved also the identity politics around religion. I think there is no doubt that neoliberalism, which India has adopted since 1990, has exacerbated, and that's a very complex thing to analyze, what is the complicit relation between neoliberal political economies ever since Manmohan Singh's transformations in 1990 of the Indian political economy, and the increasing Hindutva politics of the country. That's very well worth analyzing. It's a very complex issue. There's nothing simple to say about it. But there's no doubt that they work mutually. But I don't know enough. You see, I think the emergency was an assertion of authoritarianism that has got very much to do with the failures of the Congress Party to retain its grassroots. I think that's the real source of the authoritarianism of the emergency. What the emergency is really due to is the fact that the Congress Party, which really, Congress politics was Indian politics. You know, Kothari had, Rajni Kothari, the political theorist, is worth reading. He's an interesting theorist who actually called Indian politics, the whole of Indian politics, the Congress system. That's a metonymical description. So the Congress Party was, in a sense, India. You know, it had its tentacles, its grassroots in all parts of the country. What the emergency did was to make the Congress Party very much a Delhi-centered party. It became not only Delhi-centered, but it became a much more technocratic set of commitments, which was followed up by Rajiv Gandhi and so on. And by the time you got the reforms of 1990, with the international credit agencies dictating policies and so on, it became suffused into the political economy, and that's the real change. The real change is, I mean, the left was always critical of the Congress Party for not being, providing enough welfare for ordinary people. But nevertheless, the Congress Party had some grassroots all over the country. That's what the emergency destroyed, right? And the Congress Party has never recovered from it, never. In fact, the RSS grassroots are remarkable, and the Congress grassroots are zero. It's zero right now. There's just nothing there, virtually. And that's a major transformation. You've got to keep in mind that if you have one-party domination, like the Congress had for decades, the one-party domination of the Congress was due to its leading role in a long freedom movement, right? Which laid down some of these roots were laid down as early as that, and the Congress Party was living off that and the policies of trying to provide for a whole wide range of popular needs. That's what went in the 1970s. And the BJP's one-party domination has to be much more authoritarian than the emergency for a very simple reason. Since the 1980s, there's much more democratic noise. The Congress Party never had that kind of democratic noise which emerged with Mandal politics and the culture of benefits. Everybody was demanding some benefits or the other from the state. Caste was only the most prominent, but it became, there were democratic demands on the state from all sorts of groups, beginning from the 80s. And so if you want one-party domination, you have to fight a much louder noise after the 1980s. You have to be much more authoritarian.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. There are a few more questions and we wanted to wrap up in a couple of minutes. Rajiv bhai will wrap up. We don't want to burden you so much. And if you want to continue, I can ask other people to ask the question. Okay. Mayank is next, and after that is Alka Batra. Please. Mayank, please.
Please be
Shukriya.
Please be brief. Please be brief.
Yeah. Shukriya, Akeel Saab. I have a simple question. How do we comprehend anti-intellectual tendency and the ascendancy of right wing in India?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
How do we comprehend what's the thing?
Anti-intellectual tendency and the ascendancy of right wing in India.
It's actually a very subtle set of issues. You know, I think that a great deal of the anti-intellectual tendency, it's a very good question, by the way. It's not the usual question, and it's very well worth trying to address. I would lay the real blame, the deep underlying blame, on globalization. You see, immediately after independence, there was quite a lot of creativity amongst Indian intellectuals and academics, especially in subjects like history and economics. You had people not slavishly following ideas in the West. You know, you might not agree with all of those economists, but they were very creative. So also with historians for at least 30 years after independence. With globalization, I think somehow American ideas of what is scholarly achievement, careerism of the academy, really destroyed the creativity of the intellectual scene in India. I think that is really the very deep underlying cause. And of course, the middle classes right now are very deeply anti-intellectual.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Alka Batraji.
No, it's not Alka, it's Ashok Batra. I was using my wife's.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I had asked a question about Professor Mehta's article in the Indian Express. Professor Mehta, as you're aware of that, he was critical of the Congress Party also. He also happens to be the son of my class fellow, Rajendra Mehta. We studied political science together at Delhi University. How come no secularists came forward to submit any rejoinder to his article? I think it was a very well-written article, and there was a lot of right-wingers called him Paki and anti-Hindu and all that. I know he's very much, the family is very much entwined in the Hindu rituals and practice Hinduism.
Okay.
And my second question is, how do you view Prime Minister Modi's visit to perform Bhumi Pujan Ayodhya? Do you think it is not in conflict with our constitutional principles?
Yes, it was sickening to see it, and it was, of course, it was well, I don't know if it was in conflict with the Constitution, but there's so much else that's in conflict with the Constitution that. But look, I mean, you know, the Ayodhya temple is a good deal of the blame has to go to the courts. You can't just blame the executive. If the courts are supporting the executive, you know, then that's scandalous. You know, we should be talking. I mean, it's a symbol of the success of Hindutva, but the real suffering is. I mean, if you ask Muslims, well, what do you want in Ayodhya? You should pay attention to what they say. It's not just what you and I as secularists feel about it, but one should look at what the real needs are. And I think if you want to talk about what is unconstitutional, just talk about Kashmir. You know, talk about what happened in Assam with the register. These are the real things which are making a huge, not symbolic difference, but a huge difference to people's lives. And it's totally, it's constitutionally criminal. It's completely illegal what's going on. Changing the demographics by brute force. And it's really just like what's happening in Israel over the last few decades. And it's that's the real thing that makes a lot of difference to people's lives. I agree with you that the temple is a very large symbolic, it's a symptom of what's going on. But if you wanted to talk about transgressions of the constitution, these are the things they should focus on. People should not forget the Kashmiri people. It's absolutely scandalous that for 7 decades we have ignored the interests of the Kashmiri people.
Thank you, Bilgrami Saab. The last question is Galaxy J4. Please identify yourself, and Razi Bhai will wrap up with his question. And thanks. Galaxy J4, please.
Hello.
Yeah, identify.
I'm Shubhendra. I'm Shubhendra from India. Shubhendra from India.
All right.
Okay,
Hello.
go ahead. Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
can hear you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a wonderful session. First of all, I will thank you, and then my question is that you noted a difference between antecedent and roots, and you went on to specify a particular condition and the emergency, and you again mentioned now that was a point when Congress lost its credibility to a large extent. Now, should we then consider that as a minority, Muslims were a potential target, remained a potential target for Hindu rights for their uprise? And the only point is, or the one major point is, that the Hindutva right wing were actually lacking from a credibility. In the time of freedom struggle, they were not very credible, we know. But at the time of emergency, that actually arose. And then you just pointed out that causal connections were there. Am I in the right direction? Would you please kindly tell me? Thank you, sir.
I'm afraid you're living up to your name. You're sounding as if you're from outer space. I can't
Shubhendra Bhomik. I'm Shubhendra Bhomik. Yes.
Yeah, somebody from Bengal. Somebody from Bengal.
Yes, I'm from Bengal.
Can you repeat the question, somebody? I couldn't.
It was a very long question. Can you be just on the question, please?
Yeah, ask the question, please.
Okay. I'm asking the question. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. When you are distinguishing between antecedent and roots, are you pointing that Muslims as minority always remained a potential target for Hindutva uprising? The major point being the credibility of Hindutvadis, which was not very positive during freedom struggle, but now gained grounds during emergency.
All right. So I think a lot he has already described and detailed, I think. Anyway, Bilgrami Sahab.
Go ahead, Razi.
All right. So before I conclude, I think this best to conclude. This is the last question, which is there a way? I mean, it's a Herculean task. Is there any prescription where the forces, as you have seen mobilization in Delhi and elsewhere before COVID, really can regain momentum, and that should be considered as the new politics of India, away from Nehru, Gandhi, even Ambedkar, like a new, pure, based on constitution, faceless, nameless, religionless? Is it possible to counter this?
Well, it's very hard to be optimistic about it. But once the pandemic isolationist society is overcome and human community, human public life is restored, if there is a revival of the protest, if there's a revival of the attack on the very concept of citizenship that you had with the Citizen Amendment Bill and the NRC, which together combined to push Muslims into second-class citizenship, along with what happened in Kashmir with the abrogation of 370 and the changing of the entire state. If the mobilization against that resumes, it can only build up to something effective if it's not just an urban phenomenon. It's spread to small towns, so it's not just large urban. It did spread to quite a lot of small towns, but unless the peasantry and the countryside is included in the mobilization, it can't have a nationwide, I mean, it can't really have an effective nationwide politics emerging from it. Now, I would think that the objective conditions for the peasantry, the countryside to get involved is there because they are the ones who least possess the documentation to establish citizenship. Right? I mean, they have nothing, right? You ask somebody where they're from, they say somewhere there. They certainly don't have any papers to prove where they're from and what they are and so on. So they are the ones who have the most to lose. And it would be remarkable if they didn't, if there was a pursuit of these policies and they didn't join the protest. But on the other hand, they suffered greatly with demonetization and they didn't mobilize. In fact, they voted the BJP in many parts of it. So, you know, one can't predict these. Look, it's a very, very difficult situation. I was praising Dalit agency in the last 20 years. But when it comes to the elections, the Dalits very, very remarkably, in many parts, did vote for the BJP government. Sure. This is there in the CSDS and Christophe Jean-Phil's data. They did vote for it. So what is going on? You know, it's a remarkable thing that the Dalits, what they do in the middle of the election, between the elections, is they really mobilize and fight. But when it comes to the elections, they're susceptible to being bought. Yeah. You know, so electoral politics is a very, very brittle and unpredictable field of opposition at the moment.
Let's with that
Thank
note,
you.
on that.
Razi bhai, hold on. Subhendra Saab, because we could not hear you. Where are you? If you want to ask again your question, because we didn't want you to feel like that you were not entertained. So if you want to ask question in one few sentences, because it was very hard to hear you.
Yeah,
because of the connection.
Okay,
So,
okay. Thank you. Okay.
Go ahead. Do you want to ask? Because I don't want you to feel left out.
Yes. I want to ask. Can you hear me now? Am I audible now? Yes.
Yes.
I was just asking that, should we consider that, for right-wing uprising, for right-wing mobilization, Muslims remained a target for long, and one of the lacunas that Hindutva right-wing were having, that they did not have much credibility. For at the time of freedom struggle, their role was not very clear. But at the time of emergency, as Professor you said, that there was a kind of mobilizing politics on their part, and after that they entered the parliament more vigorously. Then my question is simply that: is it that the credibility point, the point of credibility is do you think that the point of credibility is very important for that kind of politics that we saw after that mess called emergency?
Razi bhai, did you understand? Can you repeat? it was because I was losing
I
him. He
think
was cutting.
this is his third attempt, and there is a technical problem with his phone and whatever. It creates a lot of noise. What he's asking basically that if you are pinpointing on emergency, Congress misdeeds in emergency, these guys, the Hindutva guys, did not participate in freedom struggle and all those. So how credible they are, but still they are very successful in penetrating the hearts and minds of the larger Indian community. So that is his question, and I don't think that the fourth attempt will be any successful.
No, that's fine. He understood.
So if you can briefly say that.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Thank you, Subhendra.
Good. Okay, I get it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so look, you know, you're certainly right that a number of the later RSS figures were not anti-imperialist. By the way, after pretty much from the 30s onward, Jinnah was not anti-imperialist. You know, Jinnah's politics were anti-imperialist till about 1930, 2830. But after that, Jinnah was not anti-imperialist either. And it's certainly true that many of the later RSS figures, I mean, Golwalkar and so on, but there was nothing anti-imperialist about them. They were, and Savarkar, who was anti-imperialist early on, then became completely abjectly a subject of British imperialism. But, you know, there were figures who were properly describable as right-wing nationalists, like Tilak and all, who were fiercely anti-imperialist. So it's a very mixed story in the national movement. And, but in the late 70s, the Hindu right did join the mobilizations very much more forcefully. In fact, I would say that what is remarkable is, I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think they deserve the moral high ground that they got in fighting the emergency, because after all, look at what they're doing now. You know, so it's obvious that though they showed courage then, they are every bit as authoritarian as Indira Gandhi's emergency was, if not more. So, so retroactively, we can say they didn't deserve that. But I was just trying to give a kind of causal conceptual explanation for how they began to have a respectability in the field, both parliamentary and in the cultural mobilizations afterwards, because of their involvement in the
All